Just to give a brief about Climate Risk and Finance Council for those who are attending this webinar for the first time. So we are a North Carolina, USA-based non-profit organization, and we are a network of professionals, risk professionals from the banking and the insurance industries. A lot of our senior members have very wide and varied experiences and long experiences in the banking industry. So trend or rather the practice so far has been to identify what kind of risks are available or what kind of risks would affect a bank's performance or an investor's performance so long. But in the last few years, where the climate change has started becoming more and more the impact of climate change is more and more visible, conspicuous, and really is affecting businesses everywhere. So what used to be climate risk, what used to be a risk that could have been avoided, is now becoming systemic risk. And banks and investors everywhere are looking at how to identify climate risk, how to measure it, and how to implement ways to manage this. So Climate Risk and Finance Council is working towards those challenges, trying to address those challenges. We aim to be the thought leader in understanding what climate risk is, how it can be measured, how it can be managed, and more importantly, how it can be easily and practically implemented by the bankers and the insurance and by the broad investor community to understand climate risk, measure it, manage it, and help others to also identify it. They are borrowers and companies where they invest their money in to understand and manage climate risk as well. So towards that end, this webinar series is hosting a number of leading lights in the field. Today we are joined by Mr. Labanya Prakash, Jena. He is the Climate Finance Advisor working with the Climate Finance Unit of the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, and he offers policy papers related to climate finance and tries to support and coordinate climate finance mobilization in the Indo-Pacific region. So today's topic is going to be about lending and investing in a time of climate change. And we are hopeful, we are trying to understand how this the way that investors view the global south, which has a lot of challenges in terms of there's this if and when, is the trade-off between development and sustainability, and how, because the finance is going to be coming from global north, how they are implementing their conditions on global south is also a challenge that the developing countries in global south are facing. So it would be interesting to note what Mr. Prakash Jena has to say on that, and therefore we are keen to hear Mr. Labanya Prakash to give his views on that. So Mr. Labanya Prakash, if you can kindly take forward from here then. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Siddharth, for a nice introduction of mine. So let me clarify, I'm not working with Minister of Finance. So I was working with UNDP, but with Minister of Finance in developing a sustainable finance roadmap on behalf of Government of India. So the paper is not out yet. Just wanted to give a clarification about my background. And thanks CRFC for inviting me to this seminar or session. I'm glad to be here and extremely happy to share my experience, my knowledge, my wisdom with the participants. So I hope that it will meet CRFC standards. Okay, can I share the presentation? Can you make me the host? Yeah, I am already the host. Okay. Am I audible properly?
Yes, Mr. Jena. Yes, you are.
Okay, so I will start from the very beginning, since you have already said that how climate change risk is a systemic risk to the financial system. But few years back, it was only considered in the NGO community. I mean, I will say before 2010 or so, it was discussed among the NGO community or scientific community as well. So how climate change is a threat to the humanity. But in the last few years, I think from since 2015 or so, we can see a lot of discussion in the financial community as well, because it's also, I mean, proven, empirically proven, or academic literature have also come out, several academic literature. Climate change is not only affecting the society, it's affecting the economy. When the economy is affected, definitely it will create a systemic risk to the financial system. So we cannot say that financial system can ignore climate change risk, because the impact of climate change is huge. I mean, since there is no historical record, so as a financiers, many times the decision making is based on empirical facts, on the historical data points. But that's not the case in the climate change, because it's a global phenomenon. So I mean, it depends on the life of the earth. So since the life of the earth is increasing, and the human population is also increasing, the amount of carbon the humanity is emitting to the atmosphere, it is creating a lot of problems. So in the last 100,000 years, I think more than 100,000 years or so, so the amount of carbon currently emitted by the earth is huge. So if we don't take steps, so it will definitely reduce our GDP, will cause a lot of problems. Okay, just to give you a very brief background, what exactly the relationship between climate change, the economic transmission channel, and the financial risk. Many of you already know that, so I'll just quickly run. I mean, when we're talking about climate change, it can be divided into two parts. I mean, which is defined by TCFD, Task Force for Climate Finance Disclosure. So they have said, okay, it's a transition risk, which is related to policies, regulation, technology, consumer preferences. Because as we know that the policies and regulations are in the favor of climate-friendly businesses, the businesses or the economic activities which will help us in mitigating climate change or adapting climate change. So they are going to get a favorable policies and regulation. But on the other side, the businesses or the economic activities which are carbon emitting or GHG emitting, let me clarify that, because when you're talking about GHG, it's a combination of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, which is a very dangerous gas. So there is favorable policies and regulation for climate mitigating economic activities, but not so favorable regulation. In fact, I will say that unfavorable policies and regulation for carbon emitting businesses. So similarly, the technology development is also in the direction of businesses which are less carbon intensive. Similarly, consumer preferences are also changing very quickly, particularly in the Western countries. They would like to know that by product manufacturing a certain product or giving a certain services, what is the carbon intensity of that product or services. So that consumer preferences are also changing in the Western society. When I'm talking about consumer preferences, it's not only about product, it's also about financial products. Okay, so on the physical risk, we're talking about how the climate change is affecting the earth. So as everybody knows that it's increasing temperature, agriculture productivity is reducing, the sea level is increasing because of increasing temperature, and there are acute risks like flood, cyclone, wildfire, and heat waves. We know that. So all these things are affecting businesses and also affecting households, and it's also affecting the global macroeconomy. Particularly, this is affecting the small countries. Since India, we can say that we are lucky that we have a diversified economy, a large economy as well. So it may not affect the entire economy at the same time. But at the same time, we should remember that India is one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate change. So it's also very well known, because we are still a agrarian economy. 17-18% of our economy is coming from agriculture. More than 50% of people are directly or indirectly depend on agriculture, and our land base is also very close to the sea. Our many economic activities are also located near the coastline. So all these things are making India's economy very vulnerable to climate change. And our per capita income or the fiscal ability of the government is not very high, which can help us in adapting or investing capital in the activities which can make us climate resilient. So in a short, climate change is affecting businesses, households, and it can affect the entire economy. So since we know that if 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 there is a serious damages to the businesses, and if the businesses profitability or cash flows, if it is affecting, similarly households are also the one of the largest borrowers. So they are borrowing capital from the financial community to buy houses, to buy consumer durable goods, cars, properties, many things. So if the borrowers in the largest borrowers, both businesses and households, if they are seeing that the income are getting disrupted, we can understand that it will affect the entire economy. So we all of us know that what is the impact of decrease in economic growth or slump in economy, how it is going to affect the financial risk. Everybody knows that. I'm not repeating. It will create definitely credit risk, market risk, because there will be repricing of equities and fixed income. Because there are also empirical data which is proven that particularly in a when there is a weather related event, it also depresses stock price and bond price in certain market. And it is also proven that the companies which are exposed to directly or indirectly to these weather related events, you will see that lot of volatility of those securities in the stock market as well. And underwriting risk, because since this event climate related weather events, its intensity as well as frequency are also increasing, so it's causing huge losses for the insurance companies. And at the second time, that it's also increasing the insurance gap, because several assets are no more insurable by the insurance companies, because the premium is becoming so high, and the borrowers or the asset owner is not interested to own the asset and not interested to buy that insurance. And so, number four is the operational risk. As you know that whenever there is a weather related event, it will disrupt the supply chain. So there is a possibility of the facility can also be closed, particularly when there is a cyclone or there is a heat waves or floods. We know that heat waves, how it affects the construction business. So we can understand that in a certain duration in the summer season, particularly in the eastern part of India, you will see that even the state government, they will say, okay, you need to close down their business for a couple of hours in the summer season because of heat waves or so. Similarly, we know that how cyclone is affecting the business. It forces companies to shut down their operation. And the liquidity risk, although there is not enough empirical evidence that how climate change is creating liquidity risk, but there are some anecdotal evidence which suggests that when there is a weather related event or any event, big event, so what happens that the consumers tend to withdraw cash from banks. Okay, huge cash withdrawal by the consumer, both the consumers and the corporates, because they understand that there is a possibility that they are going to use the liquidity facility currently available very soon. So you will see that there is a lot of demand, not only from the household, but also from the corporates, because they can understand that their business is going to be affected in the future. So they would like to hold their liquidity from their lenders or so. That's also refinancing risk, in the sense that there is a possibility that the businesses which are vulnerable to climate change, whenever they are going to refinance their bonds or so in the market, so their cost of refinancing also increases. So there is enough empirical evidence available. For example, coal companies or oil and gas companies who have issued bonds of 10 to 15 years and they are trying to refinance those bonds, the cost of bonds has also increased. So definitely it's a risk for the borrowers as well. Okay, what are the events? What are the examples? I can say one, I'm just reading those things. One is the cyclone and floods. And we know that whenever there is a cyclone and floods, it may lead to reduced revenue from decreased production capacities, transport difficulties, and supply chain disruption. Similarly, there is a possibility that it will also affect adversely affect the workforce as well, particularly whenever there is a cyclone or particularly whenever there is a heat waves or so. In the construction businesses, for example, in the construction or infrastructure business, you will say that the people who work outside their office space, so they struggle, their productivity also negatively affected severely, because their health, their safety, they will see that lot of absenteeism. The reason is that under a severe weather, it becomes extremely difficult for the laborers to work. then this is creating a lot of write-ups and early retirement of existing assets. Let me give you an example. Let's say whenever there is a flood events, you will see that the houses, particularly if the houses are financed by banks or any other institutions, so there is a possibility that houses may be washed away by the flood events or by the cyclone. The houses may be disrupted. In that case, the consumer, the households who have financed the house, definitely there is a possibility that they will default. Whenever there is a default, as you know that the lender have to write up that particular loan because the household has defaulted. Similarly, an oil and gas companies, if they are facing highly transition risk, so there is a possibility that they may retire the assets very quickly and less than the expectation. It means that they have to impair their assets. They have to depreciate their assets much more quickly. So it's a huge risk for the financer, both for equity investors and bond investors as well. If the companies are writing up their assets or depreciating very quickly, it means that the expected cash flow will not be realized. So if the expected cash flow is not realized, so definitely it's a risk for both equity investors and bond investors as well. So chronic risk, here I'm talking about extreme weather variability, rising mean temperature, or rising sea level. This kind of events happens over a long period of time. That those events doesn't happen very quickly. But what happens that the investors, particularly the investors who have invested significant amount of money in climate analytic, so they would like to see that how these events are likely to affect their businesses. For example, let's say the properties are close to the sea level, and at the same time there are evidence that the sea level is increasing. Maybe after 7 to 8 years, the sea level that particular property may be submerged with sea, and there is a possibility that there will be frequent flood events in that particular area. In that case, there is a possibility that properties may be out of may not be commercially viable. Also, maybe the households may decide that my loan to value ratio is too much, so it's better to default on that particular housing loan. So it will create problem for the financer, for the bank financiers who have financed that particular property. So it's not only about acute risk, but also is a chronic risk which happens over a long period of time. I'm not talking about the risk which will immediately affect the businesses. I'm talking about the businesses which affects over a period of time. Okay, I'm quickly over things so that we can save some time. So, okay, what are the examples? For example, we know that there is a GHG emission, pricing of GHG emission. For example, carbon pricing. 1 or 2 years back, the carbon pricing in European Union was $25 per ton, but now the carbon pricing, I think, around $85 per ton. So we can understand that how the carbon pricing is increasing significantly. Similarly, here in India, Government of India also announced, I think 2 months back, that they are coming out with a carbon pricing mechanism. So if there is a carbon pricing mechanism, it means that the emitters of carbon, they have to pay a penalty to the government. So we need to say that which are the companies actually are going to pay penalty for emitting GHG. So in that case, just to meet the regulated requirement, so you have to pay, you have to invest additional money on low carbon technology. That's one. And to reduce your penalty, reduce your carbon cost, you also need to invest on low carbon technologies. It means that your compliance cost will also increase. At the same time, there is a possibility that insurance premium will also increase. Secondly, as you know that emission reporting obligations nowadays, all the securities regulator and financial regulators, they are also asking companies, asking the securities issuer, maybe bond issuer or equity issuer, or the companies who are borrowing capital from banks, they have to disclose to the financial regulators. Particularly, it is coming from the security regulators. They are in the SEC or here in India, Security and Exchange Board of India. They are asking the securities issuers, the companies which are listed in the stock market or bond market, to report and disclose the climate change related risk in their annual report. So this will give an informed choice, because as an investor, as a financer, I can understand that what is the amount of risk I'm taking, and how this company is exposed to climate related risk. So there is a possibility that once the investor realizes that, okay, this is the kind of risk the company is exposed, and this is the vulnerability, I can say, intensity of the company to the climate change risk, you will see that those companies financing this may also increase. So you may see that decrease in stock price, you will see that the bond market may crash, you will see that the banks are charging at a higher rate, charging loans at a higher rate. And there are also some mandates. I mean, we know that on existing financial products and services, particularly sustainable related financial products and services. So I'm not going into detail. For example, there are certain principles on ESG fund, because it's, when ESG fund started earlier, it was not regulated. But with passage of time, you will see a lot of actions on ESG funds as well. So there are mandates, regulations of existing products and services. So the reason I'm talking all this, you need to understand that because of unfavorable policies and regulations, the businesses are going to spend a lot of money, or the businesses which cannot spend, they have to write up their asset. You will see a lot of impairment on the assets. Similarly, the technology and market, I'm not going to discuss because there are other things to be discussed in this session. Okay, so this is a sample impact on cash flows from climate change risk. One is that whenever there is a acute risk, for example, so you will see that there is a loss of production capacity, because extreme weather events, it may lead to shutdown of the factories for a couple of days if the company has not invested in climate resilient infrastructure. And secondly, if the company's supply chain, both on downstream and upstream, is not resilient against weather-related events, it means that the company's sales will also reduce. So at the same time, it may disrupt the supply of fixed items. There is a possibility that the company may be procuring certain items from certain suppliers, but those particular suppliers may be vulnerable to weather-related events. So we need to analyze both of the inside the operating facility of the company, but also in the downstream as well as upstream. Secondly, there is also expenditure. It means that whenever there is a cyclone, flood, or any kind of event, the company has to spend money on the factories, and definitely it will increase the cost of production. For example, there's a need of higher operating cost. For example, certain offices where the temperature is increasing, so it means that the companies has to spend additional money on air conditioning. Okay, similarly, the insurance cost may also increase, because certain factories, the insurance company may be realized that there is an increase on frequency of increase in frequency as well as intensity of weather related events have also increased. It means that the company are paying that, have to pay higher insurance cost. As I said earlier, lower disruption cost to supply chain. It means that the companies which have invested heavily to make their businesses less vulnerable to this kind of events, they will spend less. So we have to see those companies that how vulnerable they are to this kind of assets. Similarly, there is a possibility on the assets and liabilities, because there are certain assets, particularly oil and gas and coal assets. So because of certain physical disruption, there are certain areas where the increase, where you will see that the events, weather related events frequency has increased very, very highly. And there is a possibility that these assets may not be commercially viable for their particular company. It means that the company has to write down those assets from their balance sheet. But more importantly, we need to see that how the lenders or the investors are treating this company from the book value perspective. For example, if any lender has invested in that company or lent that company, whether there's a possibility that the company may default. If the company is defaulting, from the lender perspective, it has to impair that particular asset from their book. Similarly, equity investors, let's say whether the equity investor is reacting to the damage to the assets, maybe the damage is not severe right now, but over a period of time, there is a possibility that the company may may not be reporting appropriately, may not taking into consideration there is a possibility of increase in intensity and frequency of weather related events in the future. But as an equity investor or a lender, I need to see that how the future looks like for those particular assets. But on the other side, that increase in the value of climate adapted assets, as I said earlier, the company who have invested in climate adaptation, because there are also evidence some of the companies, they are relocating their assets, particularly the assets, the manufacturing facility or the servicing center close to the sea to far away from the sea. Particularly the locations which are very close to the sea, they are much more vulnerable to the locations which are far away from the sea. The reason is that, as you know, that weather-related events is becoming much more frequent, as well as the intensity of weather-related events are also increasing. At the same time, the company has a huge diversified supply chain and diversified customer base. The company has taken care, invested heavily in the supply chain to mitigate the weather-related event. There is a possibility that the value of those assets may increase. Similarly, there is a possibility that the company needs to invest additional money on the capital, so just to make them climate resilient. On the transition side, so we need to see that what kind of products or services the company is manufacturing or providing services. Particularly if the companies are heavily relying on carbon emitting businesses, let's say coal, oil and gas, or any other businesses which are heavily carbon emitting, and the company is not taking right steps. For example, the companies which are in hard to decarbonize industry, like steel, cement, iron, this kind of industries. So many companies are also taking steps to reduce carbon intensity, but many companies are not taking into consideration. So there is a possibility that this company may also face regulatory pressure in the future, because carbon pricing may not be present now in India. Government of India has already declared, but it may come at any point of time, and the carbon price may increase at a rapid pace than we realize, than the expectation. So there is a huge possibility that the company who have been very cautious, or we can say they have foresightedness, they may invest heavily in their assets which can reduce their carbon intensity. So there are also discussions going on about cross-border carbon tax. It means that if you are an exporter, let's say, and you are a highly carbon intensive business, maybe there is a possibility that you meet the local regulation, but the countries like European Union or United States, they are considering cross-border carbon tax. It means that you have to pay additional money to the importing country, so your product may not be competitive enough to sell in those particular countries. So you need to see those, consider those things. Okay, carbon taxes, I have already said, that's also a regulated risk. So higher operating cost from carbon capture operating cost, because if any company, just to meet the regulatory guideline, so if the company is emitting too much carbon, so just to meet regulatory guideline, it means the company has to invest on carbon mitigating business. For example, CCUS, which is carbon capture, utilization, or storage. Many hard to decarbonize industries, they have started investing on CCUS technology. Although those technologies are not commercially viable, they are investing in this technology on the hope that one day this technology can be commercially viable. Number two is that they, just to meet the regulatory guideline where these companies are operating, they are also investing. Similarly, procurement of low carbon content material, low cost of electricity because of the transition risk, they are also doing. I'm not discussing one by one. I'm going to the next slide. Similarly, transition risk is also affecting the assets and liabilities as well. Okay, this is a analytical framework basically developed by Vivid Economics. So basically, it's a beautiful developed framework. So the idea is that you need to see that how the physical and transition risk affecting on the macroeconomic side, on the macro environment, the supply chain of the industries of the company, on the operating assets and the market where the company is selling its products and services. And on the other side, we need to see that what is the company's exposure to this kind of events, or is the company is heavily exposed or less exposed, or then it's sensitivity. We understand sensitivity, then adaptive capacity. It means that whether the company is investing or spending money to adapt these changes, to adapt the transition risk, to adapt the physical risk. That's also another thing the company has to look at. So one of the greatest, I mean, say good information, we need to go to SSB side. So basically, they have identified the industries and what are the factors, what are the risk areas of those industries. If you see those numbers, you can easily see that okay, this company is operating in the industry, what kind of climate change risk this company is exposed to. Okay, then secondly, how sensitive it is. Then ultimately we need to see what is the adaptive capacity of this. Okay, on the other side, what we need to do that on the counterparties, on the facilities, whether the facility is what is the exposure of the facility to weather related event or the transition risk is good or bad, the FAR, the sector, and the country. Country is also very important. Okay, you can ask me the question after the end of the session because it's a short session, only 1 hour. So you can ask Kumar. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so country risk is also very, very critical because there is an academic paper which suggests that because of climate weather related events or climate related risk, the country's sovereignty risk is also increases. Okay, if the country's sovereignty risk increases, it means that if you are a company and borrowing capital from outside your domestic market, from foreign market, so it means that you have to pay a higher amount, higher interest rate to the investor. As an equity investor, definitely you have to pay a higher cost of equity. So country's risk also increases because of climate related events. Okay, this is a beautiful framework again developed by Vivid Economics. So you will see that, as I said, that macroeconomic side, you need to see that how, I mean, how this country is exposed to climate change risk. You can choose the ranks, countries ranks on the climate vulnerability. There are many third-party agencies, not-for-profit organizations have come out with the ranks. Okay, you need to check that. Secondly, you need to see the supply chain of the company, the operations or assets of the company, whether the company's manufacturing facility. Then you need to see market. One by one, I'll discuss. One is that macroeconomic environment. It means the economic diversification of location. For example, whether the company's assets are diversified or concentrated in a single location, which are heavily exposed to climate change risk. For example, there are certain businesses which can stay only to the coastline. Okay, their manufacturing facility or is only close to the sea coastline. So that is a possibility that you will see that kind of businesses, that kind of facility maybe is highly vulnerable to climate related events. Then other side, we need to see the supply chain. What are my suppliers? Okay, whether my supplier are also vulnerable to climate change. Many years back, when there was a flood event in Bangkok, it affected the entire the auto supply chain in the entire globe. So it means that we need to see that what are those suppliers. If those suppliers are very, very concentrated, and if we see that the suppliers are not investing heavily or additional amount to mitigate both transition risk and physical risk, whenever there is a new regulation comes in those countries where the suppliers are operating, the supplier may struggle to provide products and services. Okay, so it's a huge risk for the company as well, particularly if the suppliers are concentrated. There are few suppliers who are supplying products or inputs or the services to the main company we are considering for lending and investment. We need to say that. Then number 3 is the location of the factory. I already discussed about that. Where are those factories? Whether the factories are exposed to any kind of risk, or for example, a couple of years back in European Union, I think since 2010 or so, so many European companies they struggle to meet stringent EU regulation. So what they did, I can say smartly but unfairly, they shifted their manufacturing facility from Western Europe to Eastern Europe to Eastern Europe, just not to meet the stringent European Union regulation on GHG emission. So, but if we see that the companies or facilities are in the economies which are very stringent. Here I'm talking about physical risk. I'm not discussing the transition risk. So, but if you see the location of these facilities are exposed to weather-related events, so definitely we will see that whether the companies have invested enough to reduce, to mitigate this kind of risk. Then definitely location of sales, whether the company's revenue are in the market which are also exposed to climate risk also. Then there is sensitivity in the means that economic dependence on climate exposed sector. For example, in the entire economy, how it is exposed to the climate exposed sector. There are certain industries which are more exposed, but in a particular country, for example, all these oil gas companies, mostly they are in Middle East countries or Latin America, or so far in Russia also. So they are heavily dependent on these carbon intensive assets. But there is a possibility that in certain locations, because of increase in intensity and frequency of weather related events, it's extremely dangerous. It's extremely difficult for these countries, for these companies operating in these countries to extract oil and gas from the sources. It means that that particular economy is heavily exposed on the physical risk part. Then second is that natural resources intensity and shock resilience. As I said earlier, that whether the suppliers have invested heavily so that they can absorb the shock. For example, if that particular company, one is that on the supplier side, but for the company side who are reliant on the suppliers, are the supplier diversified? Maybe it doesn't mean that the physical risk will happen all the places at all. At the same time, but the question is that whether the supplier base is diversified. Some suppliers may be exposed to, but a large number of suppliers may not be exposed to. But there is a possibility that some of the suppliers, maybe there is all the suppliers exposed to this kind of risk. In that case, there is a possibility that suppliers may be investing. In some of the cases, we have, there are case studies which have found out that the companies are investing money, investing capital, or giving training to their suppliers how to adapt climate change, how to develop resilience. For example, the Unilever, so particularly they buy a lot of agro products for their food processing businesses, for their food and beverage products. They have started working very, very closely with farmers, particularly in both in Africa and Latin America, because these farmers are very exposed to weather related events or so. So they have started with these farmers, and they're helping them to follow smart agriculture practices. If you follow smart agriculture practices, definitely you can make yourself more resilient. So these companies have also started doing that. But as a financier, as a lender, we need to see that whether the company are really helping the suppliers so that suppliers can absorb the shock or so. If they are not doing so, it's a huge risk for the lenders and investors. Similarly, location of the factory. So you need to see that the capital the intensity of the factory, whether the company's facility is sufficient to absorb any weather related event, whether there is drainage available, if the cyclone is 250 kilometers per hour, whether there is enough the construction materials used in the factory is good enough to absorb that kind of weather related event. Similarly, market sensitivity to weather related events and price shocks or so. Okay, so then adaptive capacity I already discussed. I am not spending time. Adaptive capacity in the sense that from the country level, whether the country has the fiscal capacity and monetary flexibility. For example, there is a study which suggests that the developed country need to spend 0.5% of their GDP on climate adaptation. But for a developing countries, it's more than 2% of their GDP. They need to invest in climate adaptation. So we can see the discrepancy between developing countries and developed countries. The reason is that developed countries, they have fiscal muscles, they have monetary flexibility, they can invest heavily on climate adapting infrastructure or climate adaptive economic activities. But for a developing country, it's very, very challenging. We need to see that where our borrowers, where our investing companies, in which country they are, whether this country are investing, whether this country have an ability to develop those kind of assets, so that the businesses can be safe in the climate change events. Similarly, producer capacity to shift supply chain, because you cannot rely on single supplier or few suppliers. You need to diversify. Whether the company can easily shift, because there are certain products the company may be using, it may be extremely difficult to switch supplier, so switch from one supplier to another supplier. Similarly, resilience of individual facility, then producer capacity to shift consumer base also. Okay, I'm not discussing. Okay, let me go back to the transition risk. Here I've discussed a lot about this, about economic diversification on political climate. It means that whether that particular economy is reliant on carbon emitting businesses. If the country is not relying on carbon emitting businesses, which is good, but if it is relying on carbon emitting businesses, there is a possibility that the country's economic growth may reduce in the future, because the consumer of carbon emitting businesses may shun these businesses, may shun these suppliers, shun these economies or so. Then you need to see sensitivity. What is the dependency on emission intensive sectors, which is very high or very low? Then the location of carbon pricing of suppliers, I already discussed that. Carbon pricing of facilities, I already discussed that. Similarly, carbon pricing of sales. Carbon pricing of sales, particularly, it's important because Europe has been discussing these things for a few years or so. Although it's against the rule of WTO, but there is a possibility that they'll come out with a mechanism which will tax the products based on the carbon intensity. There is a huge possibility. But it means that the exporter, the company which are exporting goods to European Union or United States, need to be very, very careful what is the carbon intensity level of their products or services. Similarly, on the sensitivity side, then producers emission sensitivity. Most importantly, when we are talking about sensitivity, we are not talking about sensitivity now. There is a possibility that the company's sensitivity to GHG emission or carbon emission is very, very high, but at the same time, there is a possibility that the company are investing heavily to reduce that sensitivity. Okay, if it's investing heavily, it means that they have an adaptive capacity to do so. For example, there are many energy companies, so they have started investing in renewable energy or so. But some of the energy companies, they are not doing that. What does it mean? It means that there is a possibility that they will shut down their business in the future. And some of the hard to decarbonize industries, some of the companies in these industries, they are heavily investing in the new technology like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, in green hydrogen. They have also started investing in energy efficiency products. There are large companies, instead of relying on grid, which is carbon intensive, they have started procuring their own energy from by setting solar systems on a grid scale, on a utility scale or so. One of the reasons they are saying, because there is a possibility that GHG emitting energy price may increase in the future. They are preparing themselves to mitigate the future challenges or so. Okay, so this is an example of climate risk methodology of a electricity utility. So we need to say the electricity demand by source. For example, if any company, so if the power purchase agreement is not very long, so and you are operating in a business which is carbon emitting, but you don't have a long-term power purchase agreement, it means that the buyers of electricity powers, they may not renew the power purchase agreement in the future. Even if they are renewing, there is a possibility that you need to reduce the electricity prices, because the supply of carbon intensive electricity may be very, very high, and less carbon intensive very, very low. It means that the supplier need to reduce price. Similarly, on the fuel cost, investment cost, my source, because it's also possibility that the carbon intensive cost of capital of carbon intensive businesses have also increased in recent time. it means that the company has to pay a higher cost on the cost of debt. For example, as an equity investor, I need to be very, very careful that what is the cost of borrowing or the cost of debt or bonds of that particular companies. If the cost of bonds is increasing, cost of debt is increasing, it means that return on equity is going to decrease. So I need to see from the revenue perspective, what will be the electricity price, what is the demand, whether demand is increasing or decreasing, whether the power purchase agreement, what is the length of the power purchase agreement, whether the power purchase agreement is expiring in next 5 years or 10 years. But to generate a good ROE, I need a power purchase agreement of 25 years or so. So in that case, if the power purchase agreement is expiring to 10 years, it means that there is a possibility that there will not be enough demand. Even if there is a demand, the price may decline. So it will hit the revenue immediately. Similarly, on the cost side, for example, if that electricity utility companies are sourcing, are using coal or oil or gas to generate energy, and since we know that cost of coal, cost of oil and gas, although we can say that it's a global market, and oil and gas stocks are the best stock performers in 2022, I think. So, but I mean, as an equity investors, many of them are long-term investors. They will not see the energy prices in a single year or in a few months. So you need to see that what is the trajectory of energy prices, oil and gas prices or coal prices in next many years. So we need to see that what will be the cost of operation, what is the cost of fuel. Cost of fuel could be oil, could be gas, could be coal. Since the cost of this kind of fuels are expected to increase in the future, it means that the company has to pay a higher amount to the exchequer, to the government, to the supply of this kind of energy. Similarly, carbon pricing is also increasing. If the company is not meeting the current regulations, or just to meet current regulation, the company has to invest additional amount of money, or to buy carbon. If it is not meeting the current minimum regulation, the company has to pay higher amount. So it means that the company's cash flow will also decrease. Similarly, capital expenditure may also change in the future, depending on the energy mix of the companies. If the company energy mix is tilted to energy carbon intensive businesses, just to mitigate that kind of risk, the company has to invest on assets which are less carbon intensive. All this will lead to lower cash flows, will lead to less cash flow per debt, will lead to reduce in increasing the leverage, and there is a possibility that the credit rating may also deteriorate. Then, which, as you know, it may lead to default or the probability of default may increase as well. Okay, I'll stop here because I discussed a lot. Let's open the forum for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jena, Siddharth here. Thank you so much for that presentation, Mr. Prakash Jena. We do have one or two questions here in the chat box. So the first one is by Ms. Richa Pant. So her question is like this. So Indian companies cannot always invest heavily into financing and training supply chains like MNCs like Unilever, especially when the business is hit by pandemics like COVID. So what is your view about supporting Indian supply chain financing by other stakeholders?
Okay, so other stakeholders, for example, government or multilateral development bank, there are certain green financial institutions, I can say international green financial institutions like Green Climate Fund or so. They can support in these kind of activities. But we need to remember that it's extremely challenging to raise capital from these institutions because the amount of capital is very, very limited. But we need to see the brighter side. Whether if the company's business is good, whether the company can issue bonds in the capital market, because there is a possibility that it's also empirical proven that banks don't react to climate change risk quickly, but bond market they react to climate change. And green bond is also a very good instrument, particularly where the proceeds of the capital can be used in carbon mitigating assets or green businesses or so. They can also look at those kind of financial instrument.
Thank you, sir. So if I were to understand this correctly, there was a news earlier about the government of India trying to divest its investments in a lot of these power and coal companies, government-owned power and coal companies. And there was this report which said that a lot of these, because the divestment finance for these divestments would come from largely Western countries or global North, those guys. So the point is, those guys are now saying we cannot fund this divestment because these are all coal companies and we want to get out of coal, or we want to get out of these thermal power plants. So therefore, while the government is now interested to divest these companies, they're finding it difficult to find buyers who might be able to finance this investments. So would you say that even the government would have to go through these the green funds and green bonds?
Okay, so let me clarify you that, I mean, the government is reluctant to close down coal plants, and in particular government of India, because coal plants is directly and indirectly employing a large number of unskilled people. Okay,
Yes.
so you cannot fire on unskilled people and shut down the coal plant. That's number one. So number two is that, I mean, can we rely on renewable energy? Are our grid is sufficient enough or accommodate so much of renewable energy? That's also a technical challenge everybody is facing. Okay, coming back to financing, there is something called just transition. So it means that here we are not talking about only environment, we are talking about people's lives and livelihood. As I said earlier, there is a large number of unskilled people. They are directly and indirectly relying on coal for their employment, for their income. So you cannot close down those plants just for the economic reason or for the environmental reason. You need to see that whether you are able to protect the jobs of these people. Regarding financing, it is a challenge actually. Developed countries, they said that, okay, 10 years back, we'll provide $100 billion of capital to support the transition of developing countries, but they have never actually reached that commitment. So the $100 billion is far away actually, if you say. So, okay. So that's, I mean, government of India, I don't think that it's relying on developed countries' support on their climate transition at all. Although there will be a flow of capital, but it will be minuscule compared to the requirement of country of size of like India. Because for example, if you see that government of India's own statement, they said that we need $150-60 billion per annum of capital to meet the NDC requirement, to meet NDC commitment. So, but if you see that the total amount of capital commitment from developed country to developing country is 100 billion, it means that our requirement is very, very high. So I cannot say that that government of India should rely on international support. They can rely, but its reliance is very, very low. It's minuscule actually compared to government of India's requirement. So it means that only if the government can use its fiscal muscles to support, to close down this highly carbon intensive to coal plants. There are certain reports actually which suggest that there is a possibility there are economic reasons of shutting down those coal plants.
Right.
Okay, there are economic reasons. So what you can do, you can combine a few amount of grants, some concessional capital, some commercial capital, which will help you to shut down the coal plants. But you cannot only rely on grants, because grants, we need to remember that grants are very limited, or even the concessional capital is also limited. So you cannot rely that we will only be used to use concessional capital to shut down coal plants. That's not a possibility at all. But country like India, whose size is very high, the amount of capital required for climate action is huge. So I don't think that developed countries can meet that kind of requirement. And developed country cannot support in the sense that cannot give you concessional capital or grants to help you to meet your climate goals.
So, which is why my question. So, are you suggesting something like international green bonds from the sovereign of India might raise that kind of capital?
Okay, so on the one side, we need to see that, I mean, whether it's the green sovereign bonds or sovereign bonds, government of India need to check its public debt. That's more critical. Okay, so we have a capacity as a sovereign country. We should not cross the limit of public debt. So within that public debt bracket, we may be able to raise some green bonds, maybe at a lower rate. Okay,
Right.
so that's what Government of India is expecting. Although I also contest this argument, how sovereign green debt, it is cost of green debt, cost of sovereign green debt is lower than the cost of conventional debt. So I don't think that why there is no economic reason behind that, since the borrower is same. So why there will be a differential in pricing between a sovereign green bonds and sovereign bonds. But on the other side, so there is a possibility that the Government of India may raise through issuance of sovereign green bonds at a lower cost. But I don't think that Government of India is going to raise additional capital, significant amount of additional capital through issuance of green bonds, because it will increase your public debt. We need to seriously think that we need to limit our public debt. That's not a possibility. But only thing is that there is a possibility that there will be interest differential. Not only Government of India, but also the corporates who are planning to issue green bonds.
Okay, thank you, sir. If there are any other questions, please kindly raise your hands and unmute yourself and you can ask the questions. Participants, please. Rola, sir. Argovanji.
I believe I think this is very interesting session. I think because I'm actually reading through this, I think lot of guidance on the BCBS, even the SCR, I think draft certification. I think your information is very, very valid, sir. I don't know how to actually influence the banking sector. So if you can actually throw some lights, because finally the banks actually need to what is that identify, assess, and quantify and keep some capital for the climate risk. So any thoughts how to actually push them other than the regulation? Anyhow, regulation will come, but how do we create awareness among the bankers?
One is that you need to spread awareness in the sense that how the climate change is going to affect your businesses itself. Because if the economy is transitioning, it means that the customers needs to transition. I mean, the economic agents in the economy needs to transition themselves. I mean, so banks as I can say, their future, their fortune also reliant on the economic growth. Okay, so banks can, because they have a direct relationship with the clients. Okay, unlike bond investors, so they don't have a direct relationship with the issuer of the bond. But in the case of commercial banks, particularly small or medium-sized company, whenever there is a discussion with the client, so they can say that how by following or investing money on less carbon intensive technology would help you in the sense that for the economic reason, because nobody is a noble investor, nobody is a noble corporation or so. Everybody wants to maximize profit or so. So you need to educate them that how deploying or investing money in low carbon technologies will help you in the future. How it is increasing, it's going to increase your profitability, make your business resilient. That's important. That is also missing actually in the recently the consultation paper which released by RBI 2 months back. It's not there, which I was surprised to see, because there are so many recommendations in the consultation paper, but it was not recommended. The banks need to go and discuss with their clients. Okay, that's what you need to do to stay in the business. Because for a small or medium-sized company, large corporations, they have foresightedness, they will invest. Anyway, they will invest. They have access to capital, they have access to cheap capital. But small and medium-sized businesses, these banks have a huge role to play, because they are regularly discussing with this kind of clients. They can say that how investing money in new technologies will help you, in low carbon technology will help you in the long run to stay in the business. Because anyway, some of them will do, I mean, with capital or without capital, without accessing bank capital, by putting their own money, who have foresightedness. But many of them are not going to do. In that case, banks can educate them just for their own interest, because if this business are shut down, it will be a loss of business opportunity for banks as well. That's one part. On the second part, it's also in best interest of the banks, because banks are also going to disclose this kind of information to the investors, to the regulators as well as bond investors. And they also like to see that what is the climate change risk exposure of banks. Okay, if the banks are not lending to the businesses which are less carbon intensive, so it means that it looks like a risky investment from the perspective of the bond investors who have bought the bonds of the particular bank. Also the equity investors who have invested in that particular bank. And the regulators, since they have already started integrating climate change risk in their supervisory practices, as well as both in pillar 1, pillar 2, and pillar 3. So they may ask banks, okay, you need to follow these practices, otherwise you will take actions or so.
Okay, so just one, I think one thought, because I'm earlier as a part of banking, I was part of the project finance department, because I think through that, I think the big ticket items, I think whatever actually they are taking exposures, we will be doing the management assessment, the financial assessment, industry assessment, all these things. Can we create, I think, awareness, at least the big ticket items, the PFDs, the project finance department of banks, can we conduct sessions saying that along with your regular analysis, you need to specifically cover, I think, the aspect from the climate finance, climate risk point of view?
So, Mr. Siddharth, if I can just interject, I heard Dr. Jena effectively saying, this is Sushil Sharma, I heard him effectively saying that what Mr. Jena really said is, correct me if I'm wrong, and I think Mr. Siddharth is taking the discussion in that direction. Today, you are assessing a credit file on conventional financial credit model. Would you like to expand the credit model to include ESG risk factors as well in the model, so that climate risk becomes one of the items with a certain weightage, depending on the nature of the industry? Is it a carbon intensive industry, or a hard to abate industry, or a sustainable industry, or whatever? And then the total credit score now got a flavor of ESG, climate risk, or other sustainability risks as well. Is that what you're suggesting, sir?
Yeah, absolutely, Sushilji. Yes, that's what we are suggesting, and everybody suggesting. Even that came from BIS also. They are saying that under pillar 1, so the risk-weighted assets needs to consider the climate change risk. So you need to add more risk weight. So if the company, if the borrower is exposed to climate change risk or so that is a possibility, they are saying. So they will add that under pillar 1. But at the same time, what happens that so there is a possibility. Even Government of India's recent paper or consultation paper, they have also categorically suggested that what you are saying, Mr. Sushil Sharma.
So you know this BRSR reporting, which is becoming mandatory from March of next year. Top 1,000 listed companies in India have to compulsorily file business and sustainability reporting.
Right.
This BRSR is coming up from March 23 compulsorily. So I would think that banks will then have a much better disclosure from their obligors side. You can get some information about climate and sustainability from your borrower, because he's bound to do a BRSR filing. Right now, it's only top 1,000 companies, but the way the government dematerialized shares and brought electronic trading compulsory for all scripts, like that, it is foreseeable that in stages they will extend BRSR to all companies in India. I mean, I know for a fact that in Europe, micro SMEs are exempt from similar reporting, but all other companies are covered. So information flow might improve going forward.
Yeah, absolutely right, Mr. Sharma. The only issue is that banks also rely on, for example, it's easy or cost effective for large company or mid-sized company, but if a small companies or medium-sized company, so they may find it difficult to disclose actually what is the carbon intensity. So once they disclose, they can inform the banks. Then the banks can inform. But
no, I think you mentioned that in your talk, that the large companies have better resource, better access to capital anyway.
Yes.
But I have to, as a banker, I have to factor my low-grade files also. I mean, down the credit ladder, I have to do this for all my clients. I mean, I'm reminded, you're associated with XLRA, and actually in an XLRA seminar for one of the banks on climate risk, or rather wider environment risk, the small leather units in Kanpur, which were stopped from doing their business because their effluents were being released into the Yamuna. And the banks could not recover their loans to those leather manufacturing units because effectively environment or ESG risk forced them to shut down. Then what happens to your loan?
Exactly.
You're so dead.
Exactly. That's the point, Sharma. Yeah.
Okay, that's a very, interesting points you brought up, Mr. Jena. I'm glad I took time out on a Sunday evening to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma.
Very good. If there are any other questions, please, or we can, I'll request Argovindji to kindly give a vote of thanks. And Mr. Jena, thank you so much for taking the time out for us this evening. And it was a splendid session to attend and to understand a bit more about how the banks and the investors are looking forward at lending and investment. Thank you again. Argovindji, please, if you could kindly.
Thank you, Shri Labanya Prakash Jena ji. It was an amazing journey. Three things that stood out from your deliberations today was the comprehension and the mastery over the subject which you enjoy. And the way you articulated the thought process really flowed out very naturally. And everybody was delighted to, understand the various nuances of the problem which is confronting the banking industry. Certain points which you made, and they stand out, are the amount of carbon emitted is currently huge. And if it is not contained, it will adversely impact the GDP. I mean, this point stands out. And this actually addresses the questions of Mr. Rela, who spoke from US, how the banks will be impacted, because if GDP goes down, that shows the productivity will go down. If productivity goes down, then the industry will be underperforming. And then if they underperform, they will not be able to service debts, pay the interest and installments, and banking industry will suffer. You're also right when you say that GAG emitting economic activities have to be regulated through matching technologies, because unless we meet the emission norms through efficient technology, will not be able to sustain the productivity level. And the best point which you made today was that India's economy is highly vulnerable to climate risk, not only as far as the industry is concerned, but also as far as individuals are concerned. Because now is the concept of accumulating wealth through the use of banking finances, through consumer loans or loans for computers and various things which are required in day-to-day life, or even housing loans. So if individuals and the enterprises are impacted, then the result will be catastrophic. You're absolutely right when you say that the carbon mitigating businesses need huge investment, and they must make provisions, adequate provisions. And pillar one really needs strengthening, as far as the polluting units are concerned, by appropriating a certain amount of profit for enhancing their capital and mitigating this. So thank you very much for such a thought-provoking lecture, sir. We really enjoyed, and we, on behalf of Climate Risk, we thank you very much for sparing your valuable time and guiding us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thank you very much.
Okay, so with that, I will announce the session closed, and I'll request our CRFC members to please hang on afterwards a bit, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Jena ji, thank you so much again.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.